This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of Roots and All, where my guest is the super talented and creative gardener and designer Brent Purtell. We're talking about the Capitaspring Rooftop Gardens in Singapore, which at 280 metres shares the second highest building ranking along with 3 other buildings all the same height. There are 3 gardens on the building, covering an area of 10,000 square metres and containing a mixture of ornamentals and edibles, all growing at dizzying heights. Brent was involved on the build and design side before setting up his one-man company and taking over the maintenance of the Capitaspring Rooftop Garden. Brent begins by giving us some background on this amazing building.
So, it's quite unique, quite exciting. It's in downtown Singapore, so in the central business district of Singapore. It's a new skyscraper. It was completed in January of 2022. It took about 3 years to build. It is equal second highest building in Singapore. There's actually about 4 buildings that all have the same height of 280 metres, and that's because the government actually have a cap of 280 metres on any new buildings. So it shares second place with about 3 other buildings, I believe. As you can imagine, nice, glitzy, shiny skyscraper in the centre. It is predominantly office space. So the big investment bank, JP Morgan, take up a large part of the tower. There's also restaurants that run throughout the building. And at the ground level, there's what's called a hawker centre, which would be, best way to explain it would be like a food court, because previous to the skyscraper being built, there was a famous food court on that space. And so they redesigned that, re-added it into the building. It was designed by Carlo Ratti, a famous architect, and his team. It's owned by Capita Land, which is a major property developer in Singapore and the region. Hence, it's called Capitaspring, but the landholder is Capita Land. And within the tower, 3 restaurants. On the 17th, there's 1, and on the 51st, there's 2, and 51st being the top floor. The tower is quite unique because the architects really went out the way to incorporate green spaces within the tower. So straight away, get out of your mind the idea of just a big tall tower. This one is broken halfway up at the 17th floor with a large garden, which takes up the 17th to the 20th floors, are all gardens. And then on the rooftop, there's another large garden, which is where the edible garden is actually found as well. Obviously, they had a lot of trouble building it because of COVID, but they still managed to keep it more or less to schedule. I believe they're only a couple of months over schedule. It is astonishing to see how fast they put these towers up in Singapore and within the region. Literally 24/7 building sites to put them up. So on the 51st floor, 280 metres up, is the edible garden. And that opened in about March of this year. So it's still very, very much a new space.
It sounds amazing. So how much garden space does that equate to over those floors?
17th to 20th, I'm not sure. I'll have to check and come back to you on that one. On the 51st floor, which is their kind of second flagship garden, the edible garden covers 10,000 square feet. And then the other half, another 10,000 square feet, is kind of typical low-maintenance ornamental garden. So the entire top floor is taken up by the garden. There's also the 2 restaurants up there as well, built into the space.
And what kind of things do you grow in the gardens there?
So it's a very interesting garden, and I wanted to talk about it because it's very easy to kind of do this as a marketing piece about the garden. Everybody come and visit the garden, which people should do because it's really interesting to see it. But it does at the same time have genuine horticultural interests. Some of the challenges we have up there and everything else, which is really interesting, and that's what I think is great to speak about. What shocks people the most is how much we get out of the garden. So 10,000 square feet, but about 5,000 square feet is actually planted. So the rest of it is seeding space, paths, etc. Of that 5,000 square feet, we generate about approximately 80 kilograms of produce a month go to the kitchen. So the background is that when the tower was completed, they put the restaurants out for tender. So the architects designed 3 restaurants within the tower, and then they put it out to tender to various companies restaurateurs who want to take over everything. And one company, one group came forward. They're a big Singaporean restaurant and lifestyle group. They came forward and said, we'll take them. We'll take the 3 restaurants. And at that point, they actually came up with the concept of doing the food forest, the edible garden on the roof. So it wasn't always meant to be there. When the tower was first designed by the architects, the roof was going to be entirely ornamental. And it was relatively late in the day that the restaurant group, one group came forward and said, we'll take restaurants in the towers, but we want to do this food forest. And that was really interesting and really fun to work on, but it also created other challenges at the same time. So the garden on the roof supplied the 3 restaurants in the towers, one on level 17, which is a kind of casual Mediterranean-inspired cafe, and then 2 restaurants on the top floor, the 51st. One of them is a fine dining Australian, coastal Australian, called Kala, and the other is a fine dining Japanese called Umi. So the garden supplies about 80 kilograms a month to those 3 restaurants, which, given the size of the space and the other constraints on what we can and can't do up there, is not bad. We're quite happy with it. The client, the restaurant one group, is certainly happy with it.
And does it allow you to grow stuff that you maybe couldn't buy in, or does it help the restaurant reduce costs, for example, or their carbon footprint? Or is it really just a nice addition to have for a restaurant to say that they're growing that produce in that space that's so local to where they're cooking?
I think it does all of the above. There's no doubt that by the time you factor in maintenance and everything else, you can buy produce in cheaper. That's just a fact. But I think that's no different to many other concepts around the world. What is unique is that you're growing it right next to the restaurant, and the chefs can have input on a daily basis about what we are and aren't growing. So that's the unique point about it. That, of course, then feeds into the carbon footprint and everything else. But the key thing is that it's an interesting type of a garden because it has 2 roles to play, and both of them are equally important. The first one is that it has to produce for the restaurants. And so we meet the chefs on a weekly basis and we speak to them daily about what we're harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. And then, as equally important, it acts as a ornamental garden. So it serves as a backdrop to the restaurant, and the restaurant also has their clients come up and do tours of the garden and everything else. So if it was purely production, it would be a lot easier for me just to strip it out and put everything in nice, neat rows, like you might think of a traditional vegetable garden. It's a very fine line between looking very lush and very beautiful for the public, because the public come up every day, and at the same time generating that kind of 70 to 80 kilograms a month. We could go higher. We could probably push it up to probably 90 or 100 kilograms in terms of produce, but then the aesthetics would kind of take a bit of a hit. So it's an interesting one. It has this dual purpose, a bit of a kind of 2 faces of the garden.
That must be really tricky, actually, to strike that balance.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is a challenge on my side. So, for example, we do little tricks, and we have a lot of little tricks in the garden. So, a common thing we grow is Alternate ciso, which is called Brazilian spinach, a member of the amaranth family, and they use a lot of that for their salads. So rather than having one big patch of that spinach in the garden, if we had one gigantic patch of that, we had it in rows, it would be very obvious when we harvest it, and you'd end up with having bare patches in the garden, which people don't want to see. And so the way we get around that is then, rather than having one big patch, we'll split it up into maybe 10 smaller patches and put those patches in between other planting. So we can harvest them and harvest them quite hard, comfortably get 20 kilograms of that a month. But by splitting it up and not so much hiding it, but planting around it with other species, it's not so obvious when we're harvesting. So we do a lot of little tricks like that. And then at the same time, we might, for example, we do grow some plants, not many, because the kitchen does tend to use almost everything we have. We have, by the way, about 130 different varieties in the garden. But we do have some plants that are largely ornamental. So, for example, we have a banana at the moment, and the banana has a nice bunch of bananas hanging from it. And realistically, the kitchen won't use that. They don't have any need for bananas, but it's a lovely statement piece. It's essentially the equivalent of having a specimen tree in an ornamental garden. So we do a lot of these little tricks where we can get the produce to the kitchen that they need, get that 80 kilograms a month, but at the same time, always keep it presentable and interesting for the public. Because we have probably between maybe about 200 people a day come up. So it's quite a significant amount. And we have a lot of clients, the restaurants come up for tours. So that balancing those two things is important. And that's where the tricky part comes in.
Yeah, it does sound really tricky. And are there limited hours that you can work in the garden so that you're not there when the public are there?
We can't work weekends, although to be honest, it's more choice than anything else. The public can't access the garden between 10:30 and 2:30 during the day. So we take that opportunity to do any spraying or anything like that we may need to do. That's not with synthetics, by the way, but that's with organics such as neem oil or something like that. And then the other part that's tricky is that if it rains, we can't work outdoors. So if it rained anywhere else, we'd probably just put a rain jacket on and go out and do it. But the funny thing about this is we're so high up, the risk of lightning and electrocution is so high that the slightest sign of rain, we have to go indoors, which means that when it's wet season, it does get a bit interesting of how we manage it. We have wet season at the moment, actually. So we're getting large blocks of the day where we have to kind of wrap things up and head inside.
You sound like you have picked if I say it politely, a very challenging garden role. So on top of the lightning and the public and the trying to keep it looking good and harvesting from it, you said to me in your email that you have to deal with certain pests and there's certain other challenges that you face in the garden. So what else comes along to make your life difficult?
Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting. And there's things here that nobody really considered, or to be honest, when we first designed the garden and first built it, which is why it's interesting to discuss it on this podcast. So the first one is obviously the height. That's the most obvious one. So there's many gardens built to that height, but this is the highest edible garden. The first challenge we ran into, and this has had a big impact on the garden, is sourcing quality topsoil to use in the beds. So topsoil is a scarce resource in the tropics. Singapore, the same as anywhere else. And so the quality of topsoil that you do find tends to be very, very poor, typical for tropical soils. So the soil, we did ask for sand to be added to the soil, but the suppliers just don't really have the means to make that happen, not in the way we needed it. So, for example, I've done some gardens in London where you can contact specialist soil suppliers and really get any mix that you might want, rooftop, whatever you want. In Singapore, there's just one mix. It's approved standard mix, which is dictated by the government, and that's what you're going to get. And the interesting thing about this is that we actually reached out to some of our contractors trying to be good stewards. And we said, we're doing an environmental check on where we get our produce and our sources for our gardens. Can you tell us where you get your topsoil? And absolutely none of them would tell us. It was all trade secret. And the interesting thing is because a lot of this topsoil comes from places not actually so much environmentally questionable, but more about you might send it back if you knew, basically. So one classic, I don't know if this is entirely true, but I was told that when they build these big skyscrapers and buildings throughout Singapore, they have to dig out the footings. These footings go quite deep to fit the car parks underneath. And that stuff they dig up is then used as the topsoil. So the topsoil we have up on the roof is very heavy clay mixed with a bit of sand. Unfortunately, it's marine grade sand, so very fine, very, very, very fine sand, not kind of the builder sand that you would typically use. And it also has quite a bit of rubble mixed in there as well for good measure. So that was the first challenge. the topsoil. That has then resulted in other problems running down the line, which I'll get to. So the next problem we ran into is the fact that obviously the entire space is man-made. And it's actually surprisingly easy to forget that when you're standing on one of the large beds, it is actually easy to forget that you're standing on top of a gigantic skyscraper. But what that means is that the beds only perform as well as the underlying drainage, how that was designed by the architects. And the rest of the garden are all low maintenance ornamental plants with very woody, hardy root systems. But what we've found is that putting edibles into these spaces and having the irrigation, we're running into a lot of drainage issues, a great deal of drainage issues. And we're struggling to manage that. One case is that I suspect the underlying drainage designed by the architects just isn't up to speed to cope with it. That could be an issue, but it's hard to say without ripping it all up and checking, which certainly isn't going to happen. And then the next issue is the soil, the heavy, very heavy clay soil, even mixing in sand. But as I said, it was mixed with fine marine sand, which didn't help at all. So that's the next big challenge we have. And then what has then resulted from that is that once the garden was built, we ran into serious pest issues, very serious pest issues. So we have armyworm in the garden. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. I'm not sure if it's in the UK. I can't find much information on it.
No, I'm not aware of it. That doesn't mean it's not here, but I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, so armyworm Spotoptera is a moth from North America. I think there's different species all throughout the world, but this particular one comes from North America. And it does a huge amount of damage to crops, particularly maize and wheat in the US, to the point where it affects the actual price of maize and wheat. It was first reported in Thailand in 2018, and now spread throughout the entire region, and becoming a very serious pest, to the point where there's now several conferences taking place just about this one pest, because it's shifting the price of rice, wheat, maize, big impact in India, and subsistence farmers are obviously having a very serious time. The biggest problem with this one is it's completely resistant to almost all pesticides. So we have that in the garden, which is very tricky. And then we have another one which cropped up almost immediately, which is the Hawaiian beetworm, Spaladia, which very similar. And both of those, particularly the Hawaiian beetworm, love to have the relationship with the plants in the Amaranthia family, and quite a few of the things we grow fall under that category. So those pests are having a very, very merry time, resistant to all pesticides. We don't use synthetics anyway, but even in theory, if we did decide to switch, there isn't really much we could do anyway. And those two pests, I'm sure that comes back to the soil health. There's almost certainly a link for those. So it's absolutely been challenging. And then that's the interesting thing about the construction of it, about relying on drainage systems that aren't necessarily designed for an edible garden. And then the subsequent pest issues that come into there. And then there's this funny stuff that you just wouldn't really consider. We certainly never did. So, for example, the armyworm and the big webworm, if they're found at ground level in Singapore or in the region, a common thing that keeps them under control are ground feeding birds. Wildfowl is actually a common thing kept by farms in Singapore for that purpose. But the interesting thing is we're so high up at 280 meters, we have no bird life, no ground feeding birds come up that high. We have the predator birds, the eagles and the hawks, which are spectacular when they come to the garden, but we never have the smaller ground feeding birds. And so these caterpillars are kind of having a bit of a free day and proving to be very difficult to manage. We were managing them with a BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, which that was keeping the numbers under control. However, I have a sneaking suspicion they're developing resistance, which is a big worry, not just actually in our garden, but across the region. And so now we've recently switched to spinosad. and trying to be very selective on how we use that to avoid any chances of resistance developing. But until we can really deal with the underlying soil issues, that's just going to be an ongoing thing. And unfortunately, the soil is not something we're going to be able to fix overnight. It's going to take quite some time. To give you another idea about working on these type of projects and trying to do organic gardening with almost one arm tied behind your back. One issue we had was that the soil was brought in for the garden, and then it sat in 1-ton bulk bags, the typical ones you see on the building sites, and they sat on the top of the building for about must have been a good 6 months, just sitting in 1-ton bags in the tropical sun before the rest of the development of the tower was ready for it to be tipped into the beds. So by the time it was tipped into the beds, it was essentially biologically dead. I mean, it must have been quite close to it. So talking about soil life and trying to kickstart that, you're really starting from scratch, which we're making progress. We brought worms up, and those are doing really well. They're populating through the beds fantastically well. We're adding a lot of compost. Manure isn't really an option, too expensive to get in the tropics in Singapore, so we just have to rely on compost. But the soil will be kind of a good 1.5 to 2-year project before we start to see any real change, I should say. So until then, we just have to keep on top of the pests and just do our best to manage it.
Yeah, you've really got your work cut out for you. But one of the things that was interesting as well that you mentioned to me was that you actually have a benefit in terms of altitude. And I think you found that you can grow some plants that you wouldn't be able to at ground level.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's by no means a horror story. We've had some fantastic things happen. So, as you were just saying, one interesting part was that the restaurants wanted a Mediterranean section. So the garden, I should say, is split up into different sections. There's a medicinal garden, which are plants used by the kitchen in cuisine, but also for traditional Chinese medicine. There's a flower garden. There's a Japanese potager garden, which goes with the Japanese restaurant, where we grow a lot of Japanese mustards, things like wasabina, mizuna, komatsuna. Then there is a Mediterranean garden, and then there's a native Australian garden, which goes with the Australian coastal restaurant. So in there, you'll find things like lemon myrtles, rose myrtles, and lemon gum, things like that, which is quite interesting. And those plants actually are the only ones you find in Singapore, or quite possibly in the region from Australia. We had to have them shipped over, especially for it. But the kitchen wanted a Mediterranean garden, as so many places do in Singapore. Everybody always wants what they can't have. So if you're in London, they want a tropical garden, and if you're in the tropics, they want a Mediterranean garden. That seems to be the natural thing. And we were very hesitant at the beginning because we've built many of these gardens in Singapore, and Mediterranean plants really don't do well. They really do struggle. So we kind of reluctantly agreed to go, okay, we'll give it a go. And amazingly, that's one of the best parts of the entire garden. It turns out that being so high up means, I don't know the exact number, but I'm guessing probably 3-4 degrees cooler than ground level. But crucially, we always have a breeze running through the garden. And it seems that breeze is what makes all the difference. And so we have, I think, hands down, the best rosemary, sage, lavender that you'll find anywhere in Singapore. And Singaporeans, when they come up to visit the garden, that's the first thing they kind of gravitate towards. And oh wow, unbelievable! Look at the rosemary. And that, to be honest, again, it wasn't something we really considered until we actually built it, and then realized that was going to be the case. That's kind of one of the happy surprises. The other surprises is just how much we can get out of the garden. So again, 80 kilograms may not sound like a huge amount, but you'd have to see the garden in person to understand the balance between the ornamental and the production. But one of the benefits of being in the tropics is that things grow insanely fast, to say the very least. So that's how we can get those numbers out. So the garden's performing really well. We're meeting the requirements from the chef, and then we're meeting what they need. So that's fantastic news. After a bit of a rocky start, it's looking good. The pest issue is now starting to get under control. The spinosad has been a little bit of a godsend, to be honest. It's not something I really like to use because there is a bit of a question mark about its impact on other insects. But at the moment, that's kind of our last resort, and we use it very sparingly. So the gardens are looking good, and it's generating a huge amount of interest, which is really fun. Horticulturally, it's an interesting place just because of all those challenges. It's quite unique in that way.
Yeah, it sounds it. And I think you're doing a really amazing job. And thank you for coming on the podcast to talk about it. If people did happen to be in the area and could visit and wanted to, could they do that? And also, if they're not particularly local, where can people find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you find yourself in Singapore, the tower is called Capitaspring. It is a flagship skyscraper in Singapore, so it's quite easy to find if you ask locals or somebody like that. Capitaspring. It's open Monday to Friday, 8:30 in the morning until 10:30, and then again from 2:30 until 5:30. Anybody can go up. There's no charge or anything like that. To be totally honest, it's worth going up there. Even if you're not interested in the garden, it's still worth going up just to see the view. You can see Indonesia, Malaysia, and of course Singapore from the tower. So it is an incredible view up there. It's closed on the weekends. And then if you're not going to Singapore but you still want to follow it, I post a few photos on my own social media, Instagram, which is Brent Purtell Design. So I shoot a few photos up there. And the restaurant itself, which is One Arden, ARDERN, are also on Instagram, and they post a few photos.
Thank you to Brent for speaking about his gardens in the sky, and thanks to you for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now talking about stinky pigs.
At any time of the year, even on the coldest winter day, we should be able to find resting underneath plant pots, logs, and amongst loose brickwork one of the most common garden bugs, the woodlouse, also known as the pillbug, slater, or even the stinky pig, because of its ability to emit ammonia when disturbed. And in Britain, there's more than 30 species of woodlouse, all easily recognised by their oval shape and hard-plated shell that resembles a medieval suit of armour, and with some species able to roll up into a ball when disturbed. But often referred to as insects, woodlice are not, since they're a crustacean that 360 million years ago evolved to survive totally on land. And whilst woodlice still have many closely related cousins that inhabit aquatic environments, they all share similar morphological features, such as 7 pairs of legs, and belong to a specific order of crustaceans that we call Isopoda. Terrestrial woodlice still have gills to breathe too, and just like their aquatic relatives, their blood contains copper instead of iron, and it turns blue when it's transporting oxygen around their bodies. During the day, woodlice will congregate together in damp, shaded locations, away from a warm, dry environment that could harm their delicate gills. They'll then emerge during the evening to nocturnally search for decaying organic matter to eat, and as such, play an important role in the natural composting and recycling processes that sustain healthy ecosystems. Unfortunately, though, decaying organic matter isn't always available for woodlice to eat in ultra-tidy gardens, or in a greenhouse, for example, and so hungry woodlice may have no other option than to feed on living plants, and might then be regarded as a plant pest. However, in most gardens, the woodlice will be doing much more good than harm, consuming the garden's detritus, particularly the more woody components, and enriching the soil with their feces. But where they have become a problem, the simple and environmentally safe alternative to using a proprietary woodlouse killing pesticide, which will undoubtedly harm other garden wildlife, is to sweep them up in a dustpan and release them under a hedge or in the composter bin.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.